want to ask you for your broad assessment of what we've seen in the last week between Australia and the Chinese embassy, the ambassador, and then we saw the drama yesterday with Twiggy Forrest bringing the consul into a news conference. What's your take on all of that, and where do we stand on it this Thursday afternoon?
Well, look, it's been an extraordinary process. The threats from Chinese diplomats as echoed and magnified as they usually are by the editor of the Global Times. That strange scene yesterday at Twiggy Forrest's press conference. Look, I think the government's line on this has been very measured. They're asking for an independent, transparent investigation into the origins of the virus. They're not looking to mount a campaign against Communist China in any way. But China's response, as well as its actions in the South China Sea and its recent actions in Hong Kong, I think will be spreading concern about exactly what kind of role that regime wants to play in a post-COVID world. The key thing for Australia, though, is that we don't let this become an issue which wedges our business and security communities, that we keep the interests of both at stake as we pursue a conversation about how to determine where this virus started and how to protect Australian sovereignty going forward.
Yeah, it's a good point, that that balancing act, not to rule out one or the other, because obviously there are merits to both arguments to an extent. But in relation to the Chinese approach, it's intrigued me because normally, James, they don't get on the megaphone and tell you they're going to hammer you in an economic sense. They just do it, like they did with South Korea in recent times.
Yeah, and the dynamics of that are not entirely one way. I mean, if China was, for example, to tell a lot of its international students that are studying here and have been for years that they couldn't return to complete their degrees, they would face some criticism. If they were to deny Penfolds wine to the elite of Beijing, I imagine there'd be a few raised eyebrows amongst those who hadn't stocked their cellars. And the alternate sources for the kind of goods and services they trade in from Australia are Europe and the US. And I imagine that there would be some degree of coordination between Europe, the US and Australia in terms of responding to this kind of economic coercion. So it's not all one-way traffic. And of course, China needs our iron ore going forward too, because alternative sources are quite expensive. And in an era where they're going to be facing firms who want to move manufacturing out of China, we've seen Japan doing a lot of decoupling from China in the last 2 months. There could be some economic cost to China as well from a move like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said as well, in terms of the students, but also tourists, Chinese tourists, you know, I know from looking at Tasmania and their economy, they've been loving Tasmania, and it's not like you can just turn that off, because there'll be many of their citizens who say, well, no, what we want to go to parts of Australia to visit, like my family members did, and so on. Like, I mean, yeah, there would be a cost to pay in a political sense, I guess.
Yeah, and that depends on how much coordination there is amongst other countries to resist these kind of bullying tactics. I mean, I think international trade being dictated by bullying terms, we wouldn't accept that from the US. We don't accept that from China. We don't accept that from any other country as well. That's not the kind of international system we want to have. So to protect against the erosion of the values and systems that have delivered so much prosperity for China and elsewhere, we'd want to be having pretty active conversations with our G20 colleagues, with our UN colleagues as well. So the language is probably much more forward-leaning than it should be from China. I think that tells us that there is a degree of sensitivity about any criticism that they didn't respond correctly to this pandemic, and that they're in any way responsible for the massive economic loss we've seen around the world because of coronavirus.
Yeah, indeed. There's a very clear sensitivity on that front. I guess you look at the misinformation or propaganda, that might work in a compliant domestic population. It's hardly going to work in an international setting, like the G20, where our economy is one of several that have been absolutely smashed, let alone the cost to our lives as well, and in the health sense.
Yeah, and the notion, as China always does when it picks these kind of fights with Australia, that we're merely doing the bidding of the US just doesn't hold any analysis whatsoever. At the last G20 health ministers meeting, there was a different vote between Australia and the US on how to proceed with a statement that was meant to come out of that meeting but didn't. And I think certainly, many of our people are as concerned at some of the things they're seeing out of the US in terms of its reaction to the coronavirus. So that sort of propaganda line just doesn't really hold water anymore. Neither does the suggestion that any criticism of China's government is racist. We wouldn't say that just because the Chinese government is criticising Australia's policy here that that's racist, but for some reason their propaganda the other way has had some resonance, and I think that is really wearing thin.
The interesting scenario now is we're facing this, there's so many elements to it that are just so unprecedented, but we're facing an administration in the United States under immense pressure in a health and economic and political sense as well.
Yeah, and that story you just showed about the testing, that's been such a critical issue throughout this crisis for the US. A difference between aspiration for testing coming out of the president's mouth and the reality on the ground. There's so much chaos in the US responses. We're seeing states reopening for different reasons and in different schedules, and that makes it even harder to do the kind of coordinated suppression of the virus. Some of the numbers tell the story. I mean, the CDC has such a small number of people actually doing contact tracing in the United States. They're rapidly trying to hire as many teams as they can to bolster that out. But the number of CDC experts doing contact tracing, I think, was 1/5 of the number of officials doing contact tracing in Wuhan a couple of months ago, just to put that in a degree of perspective.
We're talking about the need for greater economic sovereignty in our nation. It looks like the United States needs to bolster its own, particularly in the medical supplies.
Well, the US has been moving to onshore more of its manufacturing from some time, and that will accelerate coming out of this crisis, particularly on medical supplies. Australia is in a slightly better position there, I think. We've got some very good manufacturing in this country of medical equipment and supplies, but there will need to be incentives to do that. We're already seeing pressure on companies to do that in the United States. But for them to decouple a lot of their supply chains from China is not an easy thing. And to do it in the midst of taking on so much debt is a tough ask. The president really hasn't laid out a very clear agenda for what he wants the US economy to look like after this election, other than to say he wants it to be strong.
And just finally, on the political situation with Joe Biden, where we are in the election, which is it's not that far away now, November. There are questions as to how they can carry that out in a COVID-safe manner. But where are the politics at the moment? What are the polling numbers suggesting?
So the president's team apparently showed him some internal polling numbers in the last couple of days, which have Biden ahead in some key states. One of the surprising ones is Florida, which you wouldn't normally think the Democrats have a chance of winning, but Joe Biden is polling very well there, in part because the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, is so unpopular for his response to the coronavirus crisis. But the other issue that's looming is the sexual assault allegation against Joe Biden. There's been more detail on that. That's come from a former political staffer. More detail on that is coming out, and that will be one to watch to see whether that causes significant problems for Joe Biden if it's proved to be credible.